The ballroom shimmered with golden light, every corner polished to perfection. Waiters moved like shadows, carrying trays of crystal glasses and silver spoons. Soft chatter floated through the air, mixing with the distant sound of a piano being tuned on the stage. It was one of those evenings that looked like something out of a magazine. Elegant, grand, and almost unreal. In the middle of it all stood a man named Charles Denning, one of the country's most well-known billionaires. People called him a genius in business, a man who turned everything he touched into gold. Tonight he was hosting a charity gala for the arts, surrounded by politicians, actors, and other wealthy guests. Laughter echoed around him, but Charles himself wore a look of calm confidence, the kind of expression that said he belonged in rooms like this. But not everyone in the ballroom felt that way. Across the hall, near the back where no one paid much attention, a young server named Eli adjusted the cuff of his white shirt. It was slightly too big for him, the sleeves almost covering his wrists. He was new at the hotel and had been asked to help serve drinks and clear tables for the night. For most of the evening he kept his head down, moving quietly from one corner to another, careful not to make mistakes. Eli came from a small town on the edge of the city. His mother was sick and his father had passed away a few years earlier. The hospital bills had piled up, and Eli had taken any job he could find, sometimes washing dishes, sometimes delivering groceries. Working at this hotel was supposed to be temporary, just until he could save enough to help his mother get the treatment she needed. The only thing that ever really gave him peace was music. His father had been a piano teacher, not a famous one, but passionate. Eli had grown up sitting beside him on an old wooden bench, watching his father's fingers dance across the keys. Even after the piano was sold to pay for medical bills, Eli could still hear the notes in his head, as if the music never really left him. That night, as he moved around the ballroom, his eyes kept drifting to the stage. There, in the center of it, stood a magnificent grand piano, black, polished to a mirror shine, with its lid open wide like a bird ready to take flight. Every time the pianist played a short warm-up tune, the melody filled the room and pulled something deep inside Eli's chest. It was a sound he missed more than anything. He tried not to stare for too long. It wasn't his place to. He was just there to refill glasses, not to dream. But sometimes dreams don't listen to reason. Charles Denning was making his way through the crowd, shaking hands and greeting guests. Cameras flashed occasionally, capturing his confident smile. He had a way of commanding a room, of making people feel small or important depending on what he wanted. For Charles, tonight wasn't just about charity. It was about reputation. Every guest was a connection, every smile a deal waiting to happen. He didn't notice Eli at all. Why would he? To him, servers were invisible, part of the background like furniture that moved. The pianist played a slow, graceful tune as the guests took their seats for dinner. The melody floated through the air like perfume. Eli stood near one of the side tables, refilling glasses of champagne. He could feel the music pulling him in, note by note. The pianist's hands moved so gently, yet so full of power, it reminded him of how his father used to play. When the song ended, applause filled the room. The pianist nodded politely and left the stage for a short break, leaving the piano gleaming and silent under the spotlight. Eli didn't know why, but his feet started moving toward it. He wasn't even supposed to be near the stage, but curiosity and emotion pushed him forward. He stepped quietly, careful not to draw attention. His heart pounded as he stood in front of the instrument. It was even more beautiful up close. The keys looked like rows of pearls, smooth and shining under the warm light. For a moment, Eli just stared. Then, almost without thinking, he reached out and touched one of the keys. A single soft note rang out, gentle, pure, and clear. He froze, looking around to see if anyone noticed. No one seemed to. The guests were busy talking and laughing. So he pressed another key, then another. The sounds blended into a tiny, simple melody. It wasn't perfect, but it felt right. His fingers, though slightly trembling, remembered what to do. He could almost see his father beside him again, smiling proudly. That small moment felt like home. He was lost in it just for a few seconds, until a sharp voice sliced through the air. "What do you think you're doing?" Eli turned quickly. Charles Denning was standing a few feet away, his face hard and eyes cold. Conversations around them started to fade as nearby guests turned to look. The soft background music stopped, and the air in the room seemed to thicken. I, I'm sorry, sir, Eli stammered, stepping back from the piano. You didn't mean? Charles interrupted, his tone dripping with irritation. You're here to serve, not to play around with $1 million piano. Eli's cheeks burned. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. The room grew quieter. A few people pretended not to notice, but others were clearly watching. Charles crossed his arms, his voice still loud enough for everyone to hear. I don't know what's going on with the staff lately, he said, shaking his head. Touching things they can't afford, pretending they belong here. Eli lowered his eyes, trying to disappear. He wanted to say something, to explain that he used to play, that he loved music, that he didn't mean any harm, but the words stuck in his throat. He just nodded silently, clutching the tray in his hands. Charles sighed loudly, as if the incident had personally offended him. Go back to work, he said sharply. Eli turned and walked away, keeping his eyes on the floor. The laughter and chatter slowly returned, but something in the air had changed. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable looks while others whispered quietly. Back at the service area, Eli tried to keep working, but his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He felt humiliated, small and foolish for even going near the piano. He wanted to forget it ever happened, but his heart wouldn't let him. The sound of those few notes still lingered in his ears like a memory refusing to fade. A fellow server came up beside him, whispering, Don't worry about it. He yells at everyone. Just keep your head down, okay? Eli nodded, forcing a weak smile. Yeah, thanks, but inside he felt broken, not because he'd been yelled at, but because for a brief second he had felt alive. And then it was taken away. On the other side of the room, Charles returned to his table, grumbling under his breath. A few of his wealthy friends chuckled politely, trying to lighten the mood. But not everyone was amused. At a nearby table, an older man with silver hair had been watching the whole scene. His name was Maestro Ricci, a respected conductor known across Europe for his kind heart and love for young musicians. He had been invited as the evening's special guest. He didn't say anything yet, but his eyes followed Eli as he worked silently, his expression thoughtful. As the dinner continued, the laughter and applause resumed, but Eli's world felt quiet. Every time he passed the stage, he avoided looking at the piano. He focused on his job, but his mind kept drifting back to the music. He remembered his father's voice telling him, Never be ashamed of your gift, son. The world might not see it yet, but one day it will. He took a deep breath and kept moving, unaware that his story had just begun, and that the same piano that brought him humiliation would soon change his life forever. The rest of the evening moved forward, but for Eli, time seemed to slow down. Every clink of a glass and every sound of laughter reminded him of that moment at the piano. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with the guests, quietly doing his work as if nothing had happened. Still, inside him, something hurt. Not just embarrassment, but a kind of sadness that went deeper than words. He tried to tell himself that it didn't matter. People like Charles Denning lived in a different world. A world where pianos were decorations and servers were invisible. He had no right to touch something that expensive. That was what he told himself again and again. But even as he moved from table to table, his fingers still remembered the feel of those keys. Smooth, cool, alive under his touch. The orchestra began to play again. The music filled the ballroom, elegant and light. Guests smiled, some swaying gently to the rhythm. Eli's heart ached. He wanted to close his eyes and listen, but he couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened, the way the billionaire's voice had cut through the air, the way everyone had stared. The heat of shame in his chest, a voice broke his thoughts. Are you all right? Eli turned and saw one of the older waiters, a kind man who'd been working there for years. His name was Mr. Hensley. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were kind. I'm fine, Eli said quietly. Mr. Hensley gave a slow nod. Don't let it get to you. He does that sometimes. People like him think money gives them the right to shout. Eli forced a small smile. Yeah, I just shouldn't have touched it. Mr. Hensley looked at him for a moment. Maybe, but sometimes a man needs to touch what he loves, even if the world doesn't think he should. Eli didn't answer, but those words stayed with him. Across the room, Charles Denning laughed loudly at something one of his guests said. The tension from earlier seemed to have disappeared for him. He was back to being the charming host, shaking hands, telling stories about his latest business ventures. Cameras flashed again. People leaned closer, eager to be in his circle. But not everyone was smiling. From a nearby table, Maestro Ricci was still watching quietly. He had seen the entire scene, from the moment Eli touched the piano to the way Denning had humiliated him. He had also noticed something else, something most people missed, the way Eli's fingers had moved on the keys. Even in those few seconds, the boy had played with real emotion, with the kind of touch that couldn't be taught easily. It was instinctive, honest. The maestro didn't say a word. He simply took another sip of his wine and waited. Meanwhile, Eli continued to work. He cleared plates, refilled drinks, and carried trays heavier than he should have. Each time he passed by the stage, his eyes flickered toward the piano but quickly turned away. He was too afraid to look for too long. After a while, the music stopped and the pianist who had been performing earlier returned to the stage. The guests clapped politely as he began another soft tune. Eli paused near one of the side doors just for a moment, listening. The melody was perfect, but somehow it didn't have the warmth his father's music had. It was skillful, but it felt cold. He sighed quietly and went back to work. Half an hour later, the dinner portion of the gala was over and the pianist took another break. Guests stood up to chat, forming small groups. The hum of conversation filled the air again. Eli walked around collecting empty glasses, his movements automatic. That's when he noticed a small spill near the stage. A guest had accidentally dropped a drink close to one of the cables near the piano. He hurried over with a cloth to clean it up. He crouched down, carefully wiping the floor so the liquid wouldn't damage any of the instruments or wires. When he finished, he stood up again and realized he was once again right in front of the piano. It glimmered under the lights, the same way it had before. The same quiet pull filled his chest, that strange feeling that made him forget where he was. He hesitated, his hands tightening around the cloth. Don't. Just walk away, he told himself. But something deep inside whispered the opposite. He looked around. The pianist was still away, the guests busy talking. The moment felt still, like the world had paused just for him. Slowly, almost against his will, he reached out again and pressed a single note. So soft it was barely audible. It rang through the air, sweet and gentle. One note, then another. He wasn't trying to play a song this time. It was like his fingers had their own memory, telling a story his voice couldn't. Before he knew it, the notes began to form a melody, faint, but full of emotion. It was the same tune his father used to hum when fixing the old piano at home. But this time something was different. The sound felt bigger, richer. Then a shadow moved across the floor. Eli's heart jumped. He turned, expecting to see Charles Denning again. But instead it was the old maestro. The conductor stood quietly watching. His eyes weren't angry. They were calm, curious, almost kind. Eli froze. "I'm sorry, sir," he said quickly. "I didn't mean to—" The maestro raised his hand gently, stopping him. "No need to apologize." His voice was soft, accented, full of calm authority. "Do you play often?" Eli hesitated. "Not anymore, sir. I used to. My father taught me, but we sold our piano a few years ago." The maestro studied him for a moment. "That's a shame," he said quietly. "Your hands, they move like someone who has lived with music, not just learned it." Eli didn't know what to say. He looked down, embarrassed. "It's just something I remember from before. I didn't mean to cause trouble earlier." The maestro smiled faintly. "The only trouble in this world is when music is silenced." Before Eli could respond, another voice cut through the space, loud, sharp, and unmistakable. "What is going on here?" Charles Denning was approaching again, his expression dark. The maestro turned to face him, calm as ever. "Ah, Mr. Denning," the maestro said. "I was just speaking with this young man. He has a natural touch for the piano." Charles frowned, glancing at Eli. "Natural touch? He's a server, not a musician. He's already been warned once." "I see," the maestro said, his tone polite but firm. "Then perhaps you should let him prove himself. A gift like that shouldn't be wasted." The room began to quiet again as guests noticed what was happening. A few turned to watch, whispering to one another. Charles chuckled, though it sounded forced. "You can't be serious, maestro. This boy doesn't belong on that stage. He should be working, not performing." The maestro smiled slightly. "I'm very serious, my friend. Let him play. For a moment, Charles looked uncertain. He didn't want to appear rude in front of his distinguished guest, especially one as respected as the maestro. His pride, however, made it hard to agree. Eli's heart pounded so loudly he thought everyone could hear it. "Please, sir," he said quickly, trying to diffuse the moment. "It's fine. I don't need to." But the maestro gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "You should." His eyes met Eli's, steady and encouraging. "Play what's in your heart." The room went still. The pianist, who had just returned, paused by the door, unsure what to do. The guests turned their attention toward the stage, curiosity written on their faces. Charles sighed and stepped back, muttering, "Fine. Let's see what happens." Eli swallowed hard. His legs felt weak. He looked at the piano, then at the maestro, who gave him a reassuring nod. Slowly, Eli sat down on the bench. His hands hovered above the keys, trembling. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The noise of the crowd faded away. He thought of his father, of their tiny living room, of the laughter that used to fill it when they played together. He thought of his mother, who always said music was the only medicine that didn't cost anything. And then, he began to play. At first, the notes came quietly, uncertainly. But soon something shifted. His fingers moved with confidence, finding the melody buried deep inside him. It was the song his father had written, a piece about hope, about love, about holding on when the world felt too heavy. The sound filled the ballroom. The guests stopped whispering. Even the clinking of glasses halted. For the first time all evening, the grand piano wasn't just an instrument. It was a voice, Eli's voice, telling his story without a single word. Charles Denning stood near the back, his arms crossed, but his expression slowly changed. The arrogance in his eyes softened, replaced by something he hadn't felt in a long time, humility. And as the last note lingered in the air, a silence deeper than applause filled the room. The world seemed to hold its breath. The last note of Eli's song hung in the air like a soft whisper that refused to fade. No one moved. The entire ballroom had gone completely still, as if even time itself had stopped to listen. The sound had carried something pure, something words couldn't explain. Eli sat frozen on the bench, his fingers still resting on the keys. His heart was pounding so hard it almost hurt. He was afraid to look up, afraid to see the faces of the people in front of him. For a few seconds he thought maybe he had gone too far again, that this time he had really made a mistake he couldn't fix. Then, a single clap broke the silence. It came from the maestro. Slow, steady, sincere. Another person joined, then another. Within seconds, the entire room was filled with applause. People stood up from their seats, clapping, cheering softly, some even wiping tears from their eyes. Eli blinked, unable to believe what was happening. He looked around, confused, overwhelmed. He had never seen anything like this. So many people, so many strangers, all standing because of him. The maestro smiled warmly and stepped forward, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "Now that," he said, "is what music should feel like." The guests clapped even louder. Someone called out, "Encore!" Another said, "Who is he?" Eli felt dizzy. He didn't know what to do. He looked at the maestro, who gave him a gentle nod. "Take a bow," he whispered. Eli hesitated, then slowly stood and bowed his head slightly. The applause grew even stronger. Cameras flashed again, but this time they weren't pointed at the billionaire host or the rich guests. They were pointed at him. From across the room, Charles Denning watched, his jaw tight. He didn't clap right away. His eyes followed the young server standing beside the piano, the same one he had yelled at earlier. Something in his chest twisted. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. When the applause finally began to fade, the maestro turned to him and said with quiet firmness, "You see, Mr. Denning, music doesn't care about titles or wealth. It only listens to the heart." Charles didn't respond right away. For the first time that evening, he had nothing clever to say. He just nodded stiffly and turned toward the bar, muttering something about getting another drink. Eli left the stage quickly, trying not to draw more attention. He felt lightheaded and unsure if he was supposed to go back to work or just disappear. The other servers stared at him with wide eyes. Mr. Hensley gave him a small, proud smile but said nothing. He went back to the service area, setting down the tray he still carried. His hands were shaking slightly. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes, trying to catch his breath. He hadn't planned any of that. He didn't even know why he had agreed to play. But somehow, for the first time in a long time, he felt alive. A few minutes later, the maestro appeared beside him. "You play beautifully," he said softly. Eli straightened up immediately. "Thank you, sir. I'm sorry if I caused trouble." "I didn't mean to steal attention or—" The maestro interrupted him gently. "No apologies. You gave these people something real tonight. Do you understand how rare that is?" Eli shook his head. "I just played what I felt." "That," the maestro said with a smile, "is exactly why it was perfect." Before Eli could say anything else, a young assistant walked over to the maestro, whispering something in his ear. The maestro nodded and turned back to Eli. "I want to hear you play again sometime. Truly play. Would you come by the conservatory tomorrow? I have a few friends there who would love to meet you." Eli's eyes widened. "The conservatory? I'm just a waiter, sir. I don't even have my own piano." The maestro placed a hand on his shoulder. "Talent like yours doesn't need to be owned. It only needs to be heard." Eli didn't know how to respond. All he could do was nod. As the maestro walked away, Eli stood there for a long time, his mind spinning. Was this really happening? Could this one night change everything? Meanwhile, across the ballroom, Charles Denning stood alone by the large window, a drink in his hand. He stared out at the city lights, lost in thought. The applause from earlier still echoed in his head. He had been sure the young man was out of line, sure he was just another careless worker. But when Eli had played, something inside Charles had shifted. He had built his empire by being tough, by believing that only the strongest survived. But hearing that music reminded him of something he hadn't felt in years: humility. It made him think of his late wife, who used to love music. She had always said that kindness was worth more than success. He had ignored her then, but now her words seemed to whisper back through time. He didn't say anything to anyone. He just finished his drink quietly, his thoughts heavy. As the evening came to a close, guests began leaving, still talking about the boy who played the piano. Some said they hadn't heard anything that beautiful in years. Others wondered if he was a professional pretending to be a waiter. No one seemed to know for sure. Eli, exhausted, stayed behind to help clean up. The glamour of the event faded quickly once the lights dimmed and the tables were cleared. Empty glasses, crumpled napkins, and half-eaten desserts filled the once perfect room. Mr. Hensley walked by, patting Eli's shoulder. "You made history tonight, kid," he said with a grin. Eli laughed softly. "I don't know about that." But deep down, something told him his life had just changed. When he finally got home that night, the sky was already turning pale with the first hint of morning. His mother was asleep in her chair, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. He placed a gentle kiss on her forehead, then sat by the window. The city outside was quiet, only a few cars passing by. He still couldn't believe what had happened: the piano, the applause, the maestro's offer. It felt like a dream. He whispered softly to himself, "Dad, I wish you could have seen it." The next morning he woke up early. His uniform was still hanging by the door, but his thoughts were somewhere else. He kept replaying the maestro's words. Come by the conservatory. He almost didn't go. He told himself he didn't belong there, that it was a mistake. But by noon, something inside him pushed him out the door. The conservatory was a large old building with tall windows and marble steps. Music floated faintly through the air even before he walked in. He felt small, almost like a child again. When he reached the front desk, he hesitated, then said quietly, "I'm here to see Maestro Ricci." The receptionist smiled. "He's expecting you." A few minutes later, Eli was led to a large hall where a grand piano sat under soft sunlight. The maestro was there talking with two other musicians. When he saw Eli, his face brightened. "Ah, you came." Eli nodded nervously. "I wasn't sure if—" "Of course you should come," the maestro said warmly. "Now play something for us." Eli hesitated. His hands felt cold, his heart racing. But then he sat down at the piano and closed his eyes. He began to play the same melody he had played the night before, only this time slower, deeper, with more emotion. The notes filled the room, echoing off the walls. The other musicians listened in silence, nodding softly. When he finished, the maestro looked at him with quiet pride. "You have something rare, my boy. Not just skill, but soul." Eli swallowed hard. Thank you, sir. The maestro smiled. I want to help you. I can arrange lessons, maybe even a scholarship. You have a gift that must not be hidden. Eli couldn't speak for a moment. His eyes burned with tears he tried to hold back. I don't know how to thank you, he finally whispered. Just promise me one thing, the maestro said. Never stop playing. Outside the window, sunlight spilled across the piano keys, making them shine like they did the night before. Back in his office, across town, Charles Denning sat staring at an envelope on his desk. Inside it was a check, a donation to the conservatory. He had made it out anonymously, writing only one note on the bottom of the page. For the boy who reminded me what music means. And though he would never say it out loud, he knew that moment at the piano had humbled him more than any business loss ever could. That night, as the city lights came alive once again, Eli sat at a small practice piano in one of the conservatory's rooms. His fingers danced softly over the keys, each note carrying a little more hope than the last. And though his world had always been quiet and small, for the first time he believed it could be something more. He played until the halls were dark and still, his music echoing faintly into the night, like a promise to himself and to the world that he would never stop. Days passed after Eli's visit to the conservatory, but the memory of that night at the gala refused to fade. It was as if life had quietly shifted for him, though nothing looked different on the outside. He still worked long shifts at the hotel, still took care of his mother, still counted coins before paying rent. But now there was a light inside him, a small steady flame that refused to go out. Every afternoon after finishing his work, he would visit the conservatory. The maestro had arranged for him to practice there for free whenever he could. At first, Eli felt out of place. The halls were filled with students dressed neatly, carrying sheet music, speaking the language of trained musicians. He had none of that. All he had was memory and feeling. But when he sat at the piano, none of that mattered. Music became his escape, his home, and his purpose. The maestro would sometimes stand quietly at the doorway, listening. He didn't interrupt, didn't correct. He simply smiled, knowing that what he was hearing couldn't be taught. It had to come from somewhere deep inside. Word about the young server with the golden touch began to spread through the conservatory. Other teachers came to listen, curious about the boy who had played at the Billionaire's gala. Some students whispered about him in the halls, wondering how someone who had never studied music could play like that. Eli felt shy under their attention, but he never lost his humility. One afternoon, the maestro approached him with a small smile. I have something to tell you, he said. The performance from that night, it was recorded. Eli froze. Recorded? Yes, the maestro replied. Someone in the audience filmed it. It's been circulating online. People are talking about you. Eli's eyes widened. Talking about me, why? The maestro chuckled softly. Because what you played touched them. It's not every day that a young man in a waiter's uniform silences an entire room full of millionaires. Eli didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure whether to feel happy or scared. I didn't mean for that to happen, he said quietly. I know, the maestro replied. And that's why it did. Over the next few days, the video spread quickly. It showed Eli sitting nervously at the piano, then playing with emotion so raw it moved people to tears. The comments were filled with words like beautiful, unbelievable, and this is what real music feels like. Some viewers called him a hidden gem, others said his performance had made them cry. At first, Eli didn't even watch the full video. It felt strange seeing himself like that. But when he finally did, he saw something he hadn't noticed that night, the look on the faces in the crowd. The smiles, the tears, the awe. It made him realize that maybe, for once in his life, he had given something meaningful to others. But not everyone felt pride. Across the city, in his glass-walled office, Charles Denning saw the same video. It had been sent to him by one of his assistants who thought he might want to know it was trending. At first, Charles dismissed it with a wave of his hand, but later, when the office was empty, curiosity got the better of him. He pressed play. The moment Eli's fingers touched the keys, something inside him stirred. He remembered that night vividly, the anger, the embarrassment, the way he had spoken to the young man. But now, hearing the music again without the noise of pride around him, he heard it differently. The notes weren't just music. They were emotion, honesty, and truth, all the things Charles had pushed aside long ago in pursuit of success. He sat there for a long time, the screen glowing softly, the sound of the piano echoing through the empty room. When the video ended, he didn't move. Then quietly he said to himself, "I was wrong." The next day, Charles called the maestro. "I'd like to help the boy," he said. His tone was hesitant, humble in a way that surprised even himself. "I want to sponsor his education." The maestro was silent for a moment. Then he said, "That's kind of you. But if you truly want to help, don't do it for your reputation. Do it for him." "I understand," Charles replied softly. Weeks passed, and Eli's life began to change in small, beautiful ways. He received a scholarship from an anonymous donor, something the maestro had told him about with a knowing smile. He didn't ask who it was, but deep down he felt he already knew. With the scholarship, Eli could finally study music full-time. He still worked at the hotel on weekends to support his mother, but now his days were filled with lessons, practice, and discovery. Each note he played seemed to bring him closer to the dream his father once had for him. One evening, while practicing in an empty hall, the maestro walked in carrying a letter. "There's a special performance next month," he said. "A charity concert for young musicians. I want you to play." Eli's hands froze on the piano. "Me?" "Yes, you," the maestro replied with a smile. "This time you won't be serving drinks. You'll be on the stage where you belong." Eli laughed nervously. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." "You were ready the night you silenced a room full of the world's richest people," the maestro said. Eli couldn't argue with that. He nodded slowly. "All right," he whispered. "I'll do it." The weeks leading up to the concert were a blur of preparation. Eli practiced late into the evenings, sometimes forgetting to eat, sometimes losing track of time entirely. The maestro guided him gently but never pressured him. "Don't chase perfection," he would say. "Chase honesty. People can feel when music is honest." When the day of the concert finally arrived, the hall was filled with people from all walks of life. There were students, teachers, music lovers, and a few familiar faces from that unforgettable night at the gala. Among them, sitting quietly in the back row, was Charles Denning. He didn't tell anyone he was coming. He didn't want attention. He simply wanted to see the young man he had once judged so wrongly. Eli stood backstage, his heart racing. The noise of the audience sounded distant, muffled. He took a deep breath and tried to calm himself. This wasn't a fancy hotel ballroom anymore. This was something different. This was a beginning. When his name was announced, he stepped out under the lights. The crowd clapped politely, not yet knowing what to expect. He sat down at the piano, closed his eyes for a moment, and let the silence settle. Then he began to play. The music that poured out of him that night was deeper and more powerful than ever before. It was everything he had lived, his struggles, his losses, his hope. The notes rose and fell like waves, sometimes soft as a whisper, sometimes strong as thunder. People in the audience leaned forward, captivated. Some smiled, others wiped tears from their cheeks. Even the maestro sitting in the front row felt his chest tighten with pride. When the last note faded, there was that same silence again, the same magical pause where the world seemed to hold its breath. And then once more applause erupted. It wasn't just clapping, it was celebration. Charles Denning stood slowly from his seat. He didn't shout or draw attention to himself. He simply clapped, his eyes glistening slightly in the light. After the concert, as people gathered in the lobby, Charles approached Eli quietly. "You played beautifully," he said. Eli turned, surprised. "Thank you, sir." Charles hesitated for a moment, then added, "I owe you an apology for the way I spoke to you that night." Eli shook his head. "You don't owe me anything, sir. If that hadn't happened, maybe none of this would have." Charles smiled faintly. "Still, I was wrong. You taught me something I'd forgotten, that talent and dignity don't wear uniforms." Eli didn't know how to respond. He just smiled and said, "Thank you." Charles reached into his pocket and handed him a small envelope. "A gift," he said, "for your next chapter." When Eli opened it later, it wasn't money or a contract. It was a note that simply said, "Keep playing. The world needs your music." As he stood outside the hall that night, the city lights shining in the distance, Eli felt a calm warmth in his chest. The same hands that had once carried trays and glasses were now carrying melodies that reached hearts he'd never met. The sound of applause still echoed faintly in his memory, not as a reminder of fame but as proof that music, pure and honest, could bring people together, no matter who they were. He looked up at the night sky, smiled, and whispered softly, "This is for you, Dad." Then he walked home, humming the same song that had changed everything. Months passed after the charity concert, but the memory of that night stayed alive in everyone who had been there. The video of Eli's performance spread across social media, reaching people from different countries and languages. They didn't know much about who he was or where he came from. All they saw was a young man pouring his heart into a piano. Eli never cared about the numbers or the views. What mattered to him was that people were listening, really listening. Messages started coming in from strangers who said his music helped them through hard times. One woman wrote that she hadn't touched her violin in years, but after hearing him play, she felt inspired to try again. Another man said the performance gave him hope after losing his job. Eli read every message carefully. Sometimes he replied with a few kind words. Other times he just smiled quietly, humbled that something he played from the heart could reach so far. He was still living a simple life. The scholarship covered his studies, but he still shared a small apartment with his mother, who was slowly getting better. The sound of her laughter returned to their home, light and soft like music itself. She would often sit by the window and listen when Eli practiced, her eyes closing as if she could see her late husband through the melody. One evening, as Eli finished practicing, the maestro called him into his office. "There's something you should know," he said with a warm smile. "You've been invited to perform at the Harmony Festival in Vienna." Eli blinked, unsure he'd heard correctly. "Vienna as in Austria?" "Yes," the maestro chuckled. "The same stage where some of the world's greatest pianists have played. They saw your video. They want you to represent the conservatory." For a moment, Eli couldn't speak. His hands trembled slightly. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. "Say yes," the maestro replied simply. "You've earned it." Eli nodded, still in disbelief. "Yes," he said softly. "I'll do it." The next few weeks were filled with preparation. Eli practiced every day, not just to perfect his technique, but to pour more feeling into every note. The maestro reminded him gently, "Remember, people may forget the notes, but they'll never forget how you made them feel." When the day of the trip arrived, Eli's mother hugged him tightly before he left for the airport. "Your father would be so proud of you," she said with tears in her eyes. Eli smiled, holding her hands. "This is for both of you," he said. "Everything I play, it's for our family." When he arrived in Vienna, the city took his breath away. The old streets, the grand concert halls, the air filled with music. It felt like stepping into a dream. Musicians from all over the world had gathered for the festival. Some were famous, others were just starting out, but everyone shared the same passion. The night before the performance, Eli couldn't sleep. He stood by the hotel window looking at the lights outside. His thoughts drifted back to that night at the gala, the humiliation, the anger, the unexpected turn that changed his life. It all seemed so far away now, like a different lifetime. He whispered to himself, "Tomorrow I'll play like it's my last time. No fear, no pride, just music." The next evening, the concert hall was filled to the last seat. People from many countries sat waiting, the murmur of voices slowly fading as the lights dimmed. Eli waited backstage, his hands resting lightly on the piano lid. The maestro, who had traveled with him, gave him a reassuring nod. "You're ready," he said. Eli walked onto the stage to polite applause. The spotlight felt warm on his face. He took a deep breath, sat down, and let his fingers touch the keys. At first, he played softly, a gentle melody that floated through the hall like a whisper. Then the music grew, filled with strength and emotion, rising and falling like a story told without words. Every note carried a memory of his father, his mother, the hotel, the humiliation, the kindness of strangers, and the lessons he'd learned along the way. People listened in silence. There were no coughs, no movements, no distractions, not just music. Some closed their eyes, others leaned forward. By the time he reached the final chord, the hall was filled with something that couldn't be explained. Not applause, not admiration, but pure feeling. When the last note faded, there was a stillness as if time itself had paused. Then came the sound, slow, growing applause that turned into a standing ovation. Eli stood and bowed, his heart pounding. He didn't feel proud in a showy way, he felt grateful. Grateful for every struggle, every mistake, every moment that had brought him here. After the concert, reporters asked him questions, but he answered simply and humbly. "I just play what I feel," he said. "Music speaks for everyone who can't find the words." The maestro watched from a distance, smiling proudly. He knew that Eli's success wasn't built on fame or luck, but on heart. Meanwhile, back home, his mother watched a live stream of the performance on her old laptop. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered, "You did it, my boy." Even Charles Denning watched the broadcast. Sitting alone in his study, he listened quietly, remembering the first time he'd heard that same music. But this time he didn't feel guilt, he felt peace. After the performance ended, he picked up his phone and sent a message to the maestro. It simply said, "Thank you for believing in him. I'm proud too." A few weeks later, Eli returned home to a small but warm celebration at the conservatory. Students, teachers, and staff gathered to congratulate him. The maestro raised a glass and said, "To Eli, proof that greatness doesn't come from wealth or titles but from courage and heart." Everyone cheered, and Eli blushed, smiling shyly. He wasn't used to attention, but he was deeply moved. As the night went on, he found a quiet moment to himself in the practice room, the same one where he had first been allowed to play months ago. He sat at the piano and ran his fingers gently over the keys. There was no audience now, no spotlight, no pressure, just him and the music. He began to play softly, a simple tune that came straight from his heart. It was peaceful and full of gratitude. Each note carried a silent thank you. To the maestro, to his mother, to Charles, to his late father, and to everyone who had believed in him. The door opened quietly behind him. It was the maestro. He stood there for a while, listening before speaking. "That's beautiful," he said softly. Eli smiled. "It's something new. I'm thinking of calling it home." The maestro nodded approvingly. "It sounds like it." In the months that followed, Eli continued to perform in concerts around the world, but he never lost his humility. He always remembered where he came from and who helped him get there. Whenever he was asked about his journey, he would smile and say, "It started in a hotel kitchen, with a broom in one hand and a dream in the other." He also made a promise to himself, to help others the way he'd been helped. With the maestro's guidance, he started a small music program for underprivileged children. Every weekend he would teach them to play, telling them, "Don't worry about how good you are. Just play from your heart. That's all that matters." The children adored him. To them, he wasn't just a famous pianist. He was someone who understood what it felt like to have a dream that seemed too big. Years later, during another charity gala, the same one where it had all begun, Eli returned, this time as the guest performer. The ballroom looked just as beautiful as before, but the air felt different. When he walked in, the guests recognized him instantly. The same man who had once been yelled at for touching the piano was now being honored for his achievements. Charles Denning was there too, older now, a little grayer, but with a softer expression. When Eli approached him, Charles stood and extended his hand. "Welcome back," he said. Eli shook his hand warmly. "It feels good to be here again." Charles looked around the room, smiling faintly. "I've learned a lot since that night. Thank you for teaching me something money never could." Eli smiled. "And thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." When the time came for his performance, Eli sat at the same grand piano, polished, shining, almost as if it remembered. The room fell silent as he began to play. The melody was the same one from that unforgettable night, only richer now, deeper, touched by years of life and gratitude. As he played, people smiled, some wiped tears, and others just listened quietly. When the song ended, the silence hung in the air for a few long seconds before the applause came. Not loud, not rushed, but heartfelt. And in that moment, Eli realized that the journey had come full circle. He had started as a nameless server, nervous and unnoticed. Now he was a musician whose music reached hearts around the world. But deep down he was still the same person. Someone who played because he loved to, not because he had to. That night, as he stood under the soft lights, surrounded by applause, he thought of his father, his mother, the maestro, and everyone who had crossed his path. He bowed deeply, smiled, and whispered to himself, "This is what music is meant to do, bring people together." Then he stood up, walked away from the piano and into a future bright with endless possibilities.